The last thing my father said about the company was not a number, not a warning, not even a name. It was a sentence so simple I almost missed how much of my life would have to carry it. Don't let him make me disappear. At the time, I thought he meant emotionally. I thought he meant memory. I thought he meant the ordinary fear dying people have when they look at the world they are leaving and realize how quickly the people in it will start rearranging the furniture around their absence. I did not understand yet that he meant contracts, letterhead, ownership, the framed photo in the lobby, the story of who built the place. My father was asking me not to let my uncle steal him twice. Once in life, and once on paper. He failed at the first one. I spent 10 years making sure he failed at the second. My name is Hannah Mercer, the man who built Mercer Industrial Supply with his bare hands, a borrowed line of credit, and the kind of work ethic that leaves itself in your bones, whether you want it there or not, was my father, Daniel, the man who sat beside his hospital bed, nodded solemnly through every family meeting, and then took the company before my father's side of the closet had even gone cold, was my Uncle Richard. And the day I walked into his office as the new owner, the first thing I noticed was that he still had my father's pen on the desk. If this story reaches into something real for you, subscribe now. Some betrayals are not crimes of passion. They are spreadsheets with a pulse. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, where winters made everything smell like metal, wet asphalt, and furnace heat, and where my father's business sat in an industrial park of low brick buildings and loading bays that looked unremarkable from the road until you understood what they contained. Mercer Industrial Supply was not glamorous. It sold valves, fasteners, gaskets, fittings, and specialty components to local manufacturers and contractors. People outside our town would have called it boring. People inside that business called it reliable. My father started it at 29 with one rented warehouse bay, one used truck, and a level of optimism that would have sounded delusional if he had explained it aloud too often. He never talked about himself romantically. He just worked. 12-hour days, weekend invoices, lunches eaten standing up, shirt cuffs grayed by dust. He built the company the way certain men build family altars, steadily, privately, and with more faith than language. My mother, Teresa, ran the back office for years. Payroll, vendor calls, filing, Christmas baskets for clients, handwritten sympathy notes when someone's employee died. She made the whole thing look stable from the inside. My father loved her, in the practical, visible ways that matter most over time. He filled her gas tank, warmed up her car in winter, took over dinner when she got a migraine, remembered every anniversary. He was not a poet. He was better. He was dependable. Then she died when I was 14. Ovarian cancer. Fast, cruel. The kind that turns a family from ordinary into before and after without asking permission. After that, the business became more than work to my father. It became the last place in his life where effort still reliably produced order. That is what I know now. At the time, I only knew he was homeless. Quieter when he was home, and increasingly dependent on my Uncle Richard, because grief had made him vulnerable in ways he would never have admitted cleanly. Richard was my father's younger brother by 4 years. Where my father was solid, Richard was smooth. Better suits, better stories, better timing. He knew how to enter a room already sounding helpful. He had sold insurance briefly, dabbled in commercial leasing, failed upward through 3 ventures, and landed eventually at my father's company under the family-friendly explanation that Dan could use someone he trusts. That sentence should come with warning labels. A struggling male relative entering a family business almost always arrives wearing need and leaves wearing entitlement. Richard started small. Sales support, vendor lunches, client entertainment, strategic relationships, the sort of role vague enough to avoid clean accountability, but visible enough to collect credit when anything went well. He loved phrases like scaling opportunities and legacy planning. My father, who trusted labor more than language, and found this slightly annoying but increasingly useful. By the time I was in college, Richard had become the public-facing half of a business my father still actually ran. My father never said that resentfully. He said it tiredly. That difference matters. People imagine good men always recognize danger clearly and reject it loudly. Often they don't. Often they are just exhausted enough to tolerate the wrong person because fighting him would require energy they no longer have. I loved the company as a child. In the straightforward way, daughters love places that smell like their fathers. Rubber, dust, ink, coffee that had been left too long on heat. I loved the warehouse cat named Murray, who belonged to no one officially and everyone unofficially. I loved climbing onto the high stool in the front office and watching invoice numbers appear on greenish paper. I loved that men in work boots treated my father with the kind of respect that didn't need performance. He used to take me in on Saturdays sometimes. I'd sit at the scarred conference table coloring while he reviewed shipments or spoke with clients. Around noon, he'd come in smelling like outside air and warehouse dust, set a deli sandwich beside me, and say, "One day this place will either bore you or teach you something. I'm fine with either. Just don't let anybody tell you it was built by magic." That sentence stayed. So did everything else. The old metal filing cabinets, the supply catalogs with curled corners, the way the office windows looked pale blue in winter, the framed black and white photo in the lobby of my father, standing beside the company's first truck with his sleeves rolled up, and the stunned expression of a man realizing something he built might actually survive. By 26, I was working in procurement for a mid-sized logistics firm in Columbus. I had studied operations and supply chain management because numbers made sense to me in a way family never had. The work was exacting, not glamorous. Contracts, inventory flow, supplier risk, timelines, cost models, quiet leverage. I liked it. I also had someone in my life my father actually approved of, which, if you knew him, was no small thing. His name was Adam. We met at a regional operations conference after mutually mocking a panelist who used the phrase disruptive synergy 4 times in 10 minutes. Adam worked in manufacturing finance, wore his shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the same point every time, and had the sort of humor that stayed dry, even when the situation didn't deserve restraint. He listened well. He didn't posture. He liked old baseball stadiums, roadside diners, and checking whether my car needed gas before I thought about it. My father liked him immediately, probably because Adam did not perform admiration. He asked useful questions and paid attention to answers. Men like my father trust curiosity more than charm. We had been dating 2 years when my father got sick. Pancreatic cancer. By the time the diagnosis arrived, it already sounded like something late. The hospital smelled like coffee gone bitter, hand sanitizer, and quiet dread. My father hated being there. He hated the gowns, the scheduling, the waiting, the way everyone around him started speaking in softer voices, as if that could negotiate biology. Richard appeared at every major appointment with an expression so solemn it nearly qualified as art. He took notes, spoke gently, told everyone he'd handle what needed handling at the office. This is how thieves in good shoes introduce themselves to a tragedy. At first, I was grateful. I was driving back and forth from Columbus. sleeping badly, helping with medications, handling insurance confusion, and trying not to collapse under the administrative cruelty of serious illness. Richard was there, present, useful looking. My father seemed calmer when he talked about the company because Richard kept reassuring him the business would remain stable. The employees looked after. The clients retained. Then small things started feeling wrong. Not wrong enough to accuse, wrong enough to itch. Vendor decisions my father had not mentioned. A longtime accounts manager suddenly gone. A new outside attorney copied on internal emails. Richard insisting my father needed to protect the company from uncertainty. That phrase irritated me immediately. Uncertainty was what cancer had done to my father's body. My uncle was trying to turn that into an ownership opportunity. One Sunday afternoon, I found my father in his den at home, wrapped in a cardigan, despite the spring warmth outside, going through a folder of business papers with trembling hands. The room smelled like dust, old books, and the chicken soup someone from church had dropped off earlier. "What is all this?" I asked. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed at the bridge of his nose. "Richard wants me to sign some temporary operating authority documents." My whole body went still. "For what?" "In case I'm incapacitated." He said it flatly, like a weather report. I sat down opposite him. "What exactly does it transfer?" He gave me the folder. I read it once, then again, then slower. It was dressed up as continuity planning. But the structure was ugly. Operational authority. Voting control under certain conditions. Accelerated decision power tied to incapacity. Vague language around emergency equity protection. Legal enough to look serious. Slippery enough to become dangerous. "This isn't temporary," I said. He looked tired. "Richard says it's standard." "Richard says whatever helps Richard." My father stared at the carpet. There are moments when the strongest grief is not over the dying person, but over watching a competent man become dependent on exactly the wrong interpreter. "I don't have the energy to fight over every paper," he said quietly. I moved my chair closer. "Then don't fight. Delay. Tell him I'm having it reviewed." He smiled faintly. "You always did know where the knives are." That is one of the last real jokes he ever made. I took the folder to Adam that night. We sat at my apartment table with takeout cartons, yellow lamplight, and an anger in me so clean, it sharpened everything I touched. Adam read the documents. Then, called a corporate attorney friend he trusted. By Tuesday, we had a second opinion. Predatory. That was the exact word. Predatory continuity structuring disguised as family business planning. I drove back to Dayton with printouts, legal notes, and the kind of adrenaline that makes even traffic sound personal. Richard was in the kitchen when I arrived, wearing a navy quarter zip and the expression men wear when they are trying to look indispensable near casseroles. He smiled. "Hannah, good timing. Your dad's resting." I held up the folder. "Don't hand him another document unless I've reviewed it." His face changed by half an inch. "Just enough. I beg your pardon? You heard me?" His smile stayed. That was the infuriating part. He could do cruelty without dropping politeness. "This is a difficult time," he said. "And your father needs less agitation? Not more suspicion." There it was. Challenge the mechanism, and suddenly, you are the emotional one. He also needs someone not trying to take control of his business while he's on morphine. He laughed softly. "You've always been bright, Hannah, but you don't understand how fragile companies become when leadership weakens." My father had taught me enough supply chain math by then to know a false scarcity pitch when I heard one. "No," I said. I understand exactly how fragile ownership becomes when someone's family mistakes access for entitlement. For a moment, the mask slipped. Only a little, but enough for me to see the irritation underneath the helpfulness. Then my father called weakly from the den, and Richard went immediately back to his practiced concern. That is what people never tell you about watching a manipulator operate inside a family crisis. The performance gets better, the sicker the target becomes. My father did not sign those papers. Not then. But cancer is not a chess opponent you beat with one good move. Over the next 4 months, he declined fast. Hospitalizations, weight loss, pain management, long nights in rooms that smelled like antiseptic and overheated blankets, machines beeping softly in the dark, my father's hands thinning, voice weakening, humor appearing only in flashes between meds and exhaustion. Through all of it, Richard remained close enough to know everything, close enough to help and hurt at once. He took over vendor calls because Dan can't be bothered with details now. He started sitting in on meetings with the accountant. He spoke to employees in phrases like, "until things settle," and "if the worst happens." I tried to block what I could, but I was one woman, 30 years old, commuting between jobs and hospice and legal consultations and my own raw grief, while the man trying to take my father's company had the enormous advantage of proximity, plausible deniability, and years of being treated like family meant safe. My father died in November. Cold rain all day, the hospice room lights too dim, a Bible on the windowsill no one opened. My father's breathing changed at 3:12 a.m. And by 3:47 he was gone. I remember the silence after the machines were turned off more clearly than the prayers. I remember the smell of my own coat, wet from the parking lot. I remember my uncle putting a hand on my shoulder and saying, "I'll take care of everything." That sentence should have broken the fluorescent lights on contact. Instead, because grief is stupid and exhausting and not nearly as cinematic as people imagine, I just stood there numb enough to let it pass. The funeral came and went in a blur of navy wool, coffee urns, folding chairs, casserole, and old men telling me my father was one of the good ones. He was. That was part of the problem. Good men often assume blood will behave decently around their weakness. 3 days after the funeral, Richard asked to meet with me and our longtime accountant at the office. I should have known. The lobby still smelled like industrial cleaner and cardboard, and the faint motor oil scent that had lived in the building since before I could remember. My father's photo was still on the wall. That hurt more than if it had been taken down. Richard sat at the conference table with his hands folded like a man opening a prayer breakfast. The accountant looked miserable. "There are things your father intended that he didn't fully formalize." Richard began. That sentence started the theft. By the end of that meeting, I learned that months earlier while sick, while on pain medication, while leaning on Richard operationally, my father had signed a revised partnership and succession package. Not the predatory one I had blocked in the spring. A different one. Cleaner. Narrower. More careful. Still catastrophic. Richard had positioned himself as controlling partner under the guise of protecting the company from instability. With buyout terms so lopsided and valuation mechanisms so conveniently opaque that by the time probate and estate council disentangled the structure, my mother's old shares and my father's estate position translated into a payment far below what the business was actually worth. Legal. Ugly. Family theft wrapped in documentation. I spent 6 months fighting it. Lawyers. Appraisals. Forensic accounting questions. Long email threads. Conference calls where men with expensive billing rates explained that while the circumstances were deeply unfortunate, the documents were likely enforceable, absent proof of incapacity beyond medical strain. My father had not been incompetent, just tired, trusting, dying. That distinction cost us millions. In the end, I lost the company. Not emotionally. Actually, Richard took operational control. Majority ownership. The client book. The building. My father's chair. His assistant. His key account relationships. And eventually even the right to present himself publicly as the man who had held the business together after Daniel passed. I got a settlement check. A legal conclusion. And the sight of my father's name slowly disappearing from the story of what he built. For a year after that, I walked around feeling hollowed out. Not because I needed the money to survive. Adam and I married. My job was solid. Our life was beginning. But there is a particular violence in watching a family business stolen because the person who built it died too slowly to defend it and too quickly to fix it. I dreamed about the warehouse for months. Not dramatic dreams. Inventory dreams. Walking the aisles and finding half the bins relabeled. Seeing my father's handwriting scraped off shelving tape. Looking into his office and finding someone else sitting with his back to the door. Adam was the one who said the sentence that changed the next 10 years of my life. We were in our first apartment after the wedding, eating leftover chili on the couch while a snowstorm blurred the streetlights outside. He looked at me over his bowl and said, "You don't want revenge. You want restoration with leverage." I stared at him. He kept going. "You don't want him humiliated for one night. You want your father's work returned to the right story." That was exactly right. And once language gets precise, decisions get cleaner. So I made one. I was not going to waste my 30s circling Richard emotionally while he enjoyed the building. I was not going to call him names at Thanksgiving. I was not going to spend years being the niece who could still be baited by one sanctimonious smile across a holiday ham. I was going to outgrow him financially. Then buy back what mattered. Not quickly. Not theatrically, correctly. The next decade of my life looked boring from the outside. That is always how real revenge hides while it grows teeth. I took a promotion in Columbus. Then another. Shifted from procurement into strategic sourcing and then into operational turnarounds. I became the woman companies called when a regional system was hemorrhaging money slowly enough for the executives to pretend not to notice yet. Contracts. Inefficiency mapping. Vendor consolidation. Capital planning. Acquisition support. Quiet work. Lucrative work. The kind of work that trains you to see how fragile, badly run businesses become long before the people inside them admit it. Adam rose too. From finance into acquisition modeling, and eventually private equity portfolio operations. I know that phrase sounds cold. Sometimes it is. But what it really meant in our house was that while other people watched prestige and title, he and I learned how ownership actually moves. Debt, leverage, exit timing, distressed assets, market fatigue, succession vulnerability, how decent companies get stripped, how mediocre operators overborrow, how men like my uncle mistake temporary control for permanent invincibility. We had a son, Luke. Then later a daughter, May. Our house filled with small shoes and science fair foam boards, and the ordinary tenderness of life moving forward despite old damage. I laughed more, slept better, missed my father in cleaner ways. The wound did not disappear. It changed texture. Less bleeding. More scar. Every year or so I drove through Dayton on business and, if time allowed, took the longer route past the industrial park. Sometimes I parked across the street from the building and sat there for a few minutes, watching trucks come and go. The first year, Mercer Industrial Supply still looked healthy. Fresh sign paint. Busy dock. The third year, The landscaping had gone soft. The 5th. They had shuttered one warehouse bay. The 6th. An old employee I knew from my father's time called me out of nowhere and asked if I had any interest in the place ever being family again. I didn't answer directly, but I wrote everything down. That is another thing my father taught me accidentally. Grief sharpens into strategy the moment you start taking notes. By year 7, supplier relationships were fraying. Richard had leveraged expansion badly. He trusted showy growth more than disciplined cash flow. 2 key clients left within 1 quarter. A regional competitor entered the market. Then interest rates shifted. Freight costs spiked. And the loose, optimistic structure Richard had been calling bold leadership started looking suspiciously like mismanagement with cufflinks. I did not interfere. I watched. At year 8, one of Adam's contacts flagged a mid-market industrial portfolio coming under quiet review by lenders. Mercer Industrial Supply was in it. Distressed but not dead. The words on the summary line were so plain they almost made me laugh. Owner succession weakness. Overextended. Undervalued. If sold under pressure. There it was. My uncle had finally become vulnerable, in the same language he once used against my father. I did not rush. That is what weak revenge does. It lunges the second it smells blood. Strong revenge waits for paperwork. Adam and I talked for months. Not just emotionally. Practically. We had children. Investments. Other priorities. Buying back my father's company would not be cathartic if it turned into sentimental stupidity. So we built the case. Cleanly. The business still had recoverable value. The client base was damaged. Not destroyed. The real estate could be restructured. Inventory systems were outdated. Staffing could be stabilized. In short, Richard had not killed the company. He had merely exhausted it enough to make acquisition possible, which is what I had been waiting for. When the formal process opened quietly in year 10, we moved through a holding structure rather than my own name. Again, boring from the outside, necessary underneath. Letters of intent, diligence, balance sheet review, site évaluation, risk modeling, legal structuring. The conference rooms all smelled the same coffee. Printer heat. Stale HVAC, no matter what city you were in. Men in expensive shoes tried to sound casual about leverage ratios. I stayed calm. Asked the questions they hoped no sentimental former family bidder would think to ask. I was not there as a daughter. I was there as a buyer who knew exactly where the corpse had been buried and what it still might be worth. Richard, from what I later learned, assumed the interest was coming from a regional consolidator. Good. Let him. He had spent 10 years underestimating me as a form of habit. I saw no reason to cure him early. The deal closed on a Tuesday. Cold morning. Gray sky. Standard signatures. Too much coffee. No violins. No spiritual thunderclap. Just ink. Transfer instruments. Lender notices. Control documents. Key release protocols. And the surreal quiet that follows any moment you have imagined for so long, it no longer feels fictional when it arrives. The building belonged to my entity by 17 A.M. 10:40. The operating control provisions had been transferred. Arun sprezece. Cinci. I was in the parking lot looking at the same brick facade I had stared at from across the street for years. The air smelled like diesel. Wet leaves. And distant snow. Adam called before I got out of the car. You ready? No. I said. Then I laughed softly. Yes. He let the silence sit for a second. Remember, he said. You're not walking in there to hurt him. I know. You're walking in to end his version. Exactly. Inside, the lobby looked smaller, cheaper. My father's framed photo was still there. But the plaque beneath it had been updated years earlier to mention Richard's leadership during a transition period. As if my father had become a preface to my uncle's story. That nearly made me lose my temper. Nearly. But anger is expensive in rooms where authority can do the work instead. The receptionist looked up, blinking once, then twice. Hannah? I smiled. Good morning. Denise. Her eyes moved to the envelope in my hand, then to the suited man from my legal team behind me, then back to me. Is Richard expecting you? No. I said, that's the nicest part. Before I tell you what happened in his office, tell me where you're listening from. I always want to know how far these stories travel once truth finally gets a boardroom. Denise called upstairs with a voice too tight to hide anything. I heard the words Hannah and legal, and here in the same breath, good. Let the announcement sweat on the climb. Richard's office was at the end of the second-floor corridor. Still in the same corner suite my father used to occupy. He had renovated it badly. Darker wood, heavy leather chairs, abstract art trying too hard. My father had liked light. Simplicity. A clear desk. Richard had turned the room into a stage set for a man performing authority to himself. When I walked in, he was standing behind the desk with one hand flat against the surface. The posture of a man trying to feel solidity through furniture. For 1 second, truly. He looked old, not senior. Old, because power ages badly when it realizes paperwork has changed sides. Hannah, he said, just my name. No niece, no sweetheart, no performative warmth. Interesting. I set the acquisition packet on the desk between us. You should have received the notices already. I said, he didn't touch them. This is some kind of misunderstanding. It's always that first. Not wrongdoing, not ownership, a misunderstanding. No. I answered, it's a transfer. His face went tight. You've been behind this? Yes. He laughed once. Short and disbelieving. With whose money? I actually smiled. My own. And people who know how to read a bad operator. That landed. Because men like Richard don't mind being called greedy nearly as much as they mind being called incompetent. He sat down slowly, as if his knees had become unreliable. This company survived because of me. I looked around the office. At the files, the expensive pen, the window my father used to stand beside when thinking through hard decisions, and finally at Richard. No? I said, it survived despite you. Silence. Clean. Useful. He tried a different angle. Your father wanted me here. There are moments when someone accidentally opens the exact door you wanted. I leaned forward slightly. My father trusted you while he was dying. I said, that is not the same thing. His mouth hardened. You have no idea what those years cost me. I almost laughed. Of course, he believed suffering was ownership if he had suffered in the right building. No. I said, I know exactly what they paid you. He finally opened the packet then, flipping pages faster than comprehension could follow. New operating structure, board authority, transition timeline, executive restrictions, building access provisions. He reached the signature page and went still. He recognized the finality. That was what I had waited for all these years. Not his apology, not even his panic. Recognition. The moment a thief understands the room is no longer available to his version of events. You planned this, he said quietly, for 10 years. I did not say it triumphantly. Just accurately, because accuracy was the whole point. Then I reached into my bag and placed one more thing on the desk. My father's original founding photo. A duplicate I had kept. The one from before Richard rewrote the lobby plaque. "This goes back downstairs," I said, with the correct caption. He stared at it, and for the first time that morning, something like shame crossed his face. Good. Not because shame heals. Because it proves the lie always knew what it was. "You're enjoying this?" he said. That question revealed everything he still didn't understand. "No," I answered. "I'm finishing it." There is a difference. Enjoyment is emotional. Finishing is structural. He asked what happened next in the way stripped men always do 100 little questions trying to find one sliver of retained control. Who stays? Who goes? Whether he has time? Whether the staff knows? Whether the board approved? Whether the lenders will cooperate? Whether there is any room to negotiate? I gave him exactly what was necessary. Nothing more. 30-day advisory option if requested and approved. Immediate removal from signing authority. Transition review. Building access subject to protocol. That part people often romanticize incorrectly. They imagine revenge means throwing someone out in a single dramatic scene. Usually the real satisfaction is quieter. A revoked password. A key card that no longer opens the same door. A title removed from a memo. He stood when I turned to leave. "Hannah." I looked back. He had aged another 5 years and 10 minutes. "What do you tell yourself to make this feel righteous?" I held the door and answered with the truest sentence I had. That it isn't about righteousness. It's about returning the company to the right story. Then I left him in the office he had borrowed from grief and mistaken for inheritance. The rest of the day was work. Real work. Staff meetings. Emergency vendor reassurance. Lender calls. Legal coordination. System access. Inventory review. People crying in private corners because leadership changes do that in family firms, even when the previous leader deserved to fall. I did not float through it like some avenging ghost in heels. I took notes, asked questions, mapped risk, shook hands, stabilized. What could be stabilized? That mattered to me too. Because my father had built the company for employees and clients, not just for the family name. Revenge without stewardship would have betrayed him again. When the day finally ended, I stood alone in the warehouse for a minute after most of the lights had gone off. The air smelled like cardboard, oil, and cold metal. My footsteps echoed lightly on concrete. I could hear a forklift reversing somewhere far off. Then I cried. Not because I had won, because the place still held him. The way grief can wait patiently inside brick and steel until paperwork catches up to memory. Adam found me there 15 minutes later. He didn't say anything at first. Just walked beside me through the dim aisle toward the loading bay, where fading evening light came in blue. "You okay?" he asked at last. I looked out at the lot. "No," I said. Then I smiled through it. "Yes." He nodded. Because that was the right answer. The rebuilding took 3 years. People loved the walk-in scene. And it deserved to be loved. But what came after mattered more. We corrected supplier relationships, rebuilt trust, sold off dead inventory, upgraded systems, brought back 2 old employees Richard had pushed out because they remembered too much of my father's way of doing things, restored the company name properly, replaced the lobby plaque, put my father's founding photo where it belonged with the exact caption he deserved. Founded by Daniel Mercer. 1987, built on reliability, honesty, and work that outlasts ego. I stood there the day the plaque was mounted and felt something in me finally unclench. My father was not back. That was never the fantasy. But he was no longer disappearing on paper. That had been the promise. As for Richard, he took the advisory window for 11 days and spent most of them trying to position himself as an indispensable institutional memory. That might have worked if he had not confused memory with control for so long. We let him leave with dignity. Not warmth, not restored status. Dignity, which is more mercy than he extended us. He tried once, a year later, to meet for lunch. I declined, not because I was still burning, because some people no longer deserve proximity. Once clarity arrives, my father's company is not what it was in 1998. It shouldn't be. Businesses that survive honestly change shape. But it is healthy now. Profitable. Respected. Not because blood triumphed. Because discipline did. People ask sometimes whether buying it back healed me. No. It clarified me. Healing had already begun. In the years I stopped needing my uncle to admit what he had done, buying the company back didn't make me whole. It just aligned the paperwork with the truth. And sometimes that is enough to let grief sit down finally. My uncle stole my father's business while he was dying. 10 years later, I walked into his office as the new owner. People hear that sentence and imagine the triumph lives in the doorway. It doesn't. The triumph lives in the decade. In every credential earned while he assumed I was still the niece he could talk over. In every contract I learned to read. In every room where I became the kind of woman men like him don't recognize until it's too late. In every quiet year where I built capital. Patience. Judgment. And timing. Instead of giving him the emotional reaction he could have used to keep calling me childish, that was the revenge. Not the walk-in. The becoming. If this story stayed with you, subscribe before you go. There are a lot of us. People whose families tried to turn grief into leverage. People who watched good men get rewritten by smoother ones. People who learned too young that paperwork can steal what fists never could. And if that's you, remember this. You do not always need to destroy the person who wronged you. Sometimes it is enough to outlast him. Outgrow him. And then walk calmly back into the room he mistook for his. My father asked me not to let my uncle make him disappear. He almost did. Then I came back with the signature page. And this time, the building remembered the right name.